Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And I'm Holly Fry.
It's time for our latest installment of Unearthed. If you are very new to the show, this is where we take a time, several times a year, to talk about things that have been literally and figuratively unearthed over the last few months. We usually start out with updates in these episodes, and we have so many updates. Like 2/3 of today's episode is updates. And then we're going to talk about weapons and what I've decided is the opposite of weapons, which is medicine. Also some books and letters. We will have other stuff in part 2 of this on Wednesday. It is October. And sometimes I wind up in the October Unearthed with sort of a collection of weirdly creepy finds. I didn't really have that happen this year. So if folks are waiting for that, I just want to say at the beginning,
Uncreepy Unearthed.
There might be some things that are a little creepy, but they're scattered around. There's not really a ghost story section.
So to kick off, on July 17th, 2019, we put out an episode on the 1944 Port Chicago disaster, which was a massive explosion in the ammunition depot at Port Chicago near San Francisco, California. So as a recap, to contextualize this update, nearly 2/3 of the 320 people who died in the explosion were Black men. The U.S. Navy was segregated, and Black sailors were disproportionately assigned to manual labor, including the most dangerous work. But conditions at Port Chicago went beyond routine dangers. Civilian stevedores and sailors alike had warned the Navy about the dangers, and Black sailors had sought help from the NAACP and the National Urban League. But none of those warnings were heeded.
So after this explosion, white officers were given hardship leave while Black sailors were ordered back to work with no changes made to try to prevent another similar disaster from occurring. More than 250 sailors refused to return to duty. They were all threatened with court-martial and with punishments up to and even including execution. After that threat, more than 200 of them did return to work. They were charged with disobeying orders, while the 50 men who had continued to refuse were charged with mutiny. They were convicted and sentenced to hard labor. Meanwhile, the white officers who were working at Port Chicago at the time were cleared of any wrongdoing.
Some of the discharges and sentences that followed these convictions were adjusted later on, and 2 men were exonerated, one for lack of evidence and one on the grounds of mental incompetency. On July 17th of this year, Navy Secretary Carlos del Toro fully exonerated the remaining 256 sailors. This followed an investigation Del Toro ordered after being sworn in as Navy Secretary in 2021, and that found significant legal errors.
We have also had several updates on the search for victims of the 1921 Tulsa massacre, which we covered on the show on July 28th, 2014. The most recent excavation at Oaklawn Cemetery in Tulsa has concluded after 4 weeks. This included the exhumation of the bodies of 3 people, each of them buried in an adult-sized wooden casket, and those bodies are to be sent for further study. The crews also found a bullet near one of the bodies.
This excavation also exposed 40 additional burial sites. Research is ongoing to determine which, if any, of these burials might also need to be exhumed. Some of the graves that have been found during these excavations were not previously documented, but they also don't match up with descriptions of the graves where victims of the massacre would have been buried.
Yeah, they have specific criteria that they're looking for in terms of which bodies likely need further analysis. Moving on, prior hosts of the show, Sarah and Deblina, did an episode on Cahokia on June 8th, 2011, and Cahokia has come up on Unearthed at least 3 times since we started working on the show. Research published in the journal The Holocene has looked at the question of whether a drought was involved in Cahokia being abandoned in the 15th century.
This research looked at the levels of carbon-12 and carbon-13 isotopes in the soil at Cahokia. Both types of carbon are involved in photosynthesis, but not all plants carry out photosynthesis in exactly the same way. Plants like prairie grasses and maize, which are adapted to drier climates, can leave different signatures than plants like squash and goosefoot, which are adapted to wetlands and forests. The people who lived at Cahokia would have used all of these foods, so researchers wanted to account for the differences in their carbon signatures in their research.
They did not find evidence of some kind of massive drought in the period leading up to when Cahokia was abandoned. The levels of both carbon-12 and carbon-13 stayed relatively stable over that time. So there's no evidence that the presence of either of these categories of plant just suddenly dropped off. So based on this, they concluded that there was not a massive drought. This might rule out one of the possible reasons that has been put forth for people leaving Cahokia, but it does not offer a conclusive explanation for why they did.
On May 25th, 2015, we did an episode on the history of time capsules. And one of the things that we talked about is that a lot of time capsules wind up failing at their intended purpose, with one reason being that people just kind of lose track of them, so they're never retrieved and reopened. That seems to be what happened with a metal tube discovered by archaeologists in Poland in the 1990s. The tube wound up in a museum, and this year, specialists from a Polish cultural foundation called Ossolineum realized there was something inside of it.
That something was a newspaper dated to September 15th, 1865, along with a note signed by the owners of the building in Wrocław, who had placed this tube along with the cornerstone for a new water tank the following day. A cornerstone is a pretty common place to put a time capsule. This one seems to have, for whatever reason, been forgotten about.
Prior hosts of the show did an episode on Pompeii in 2009, and Pompeii has made many appearances on Unearthed since then. Most recently, a paper published in the journal Frontiers in Earth Science in July adds to ongoing research into whether there was an earthquake during the eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79, or if seismic activity ended before the volcano began. It's well established that there was some seismic activity, but there have been ongoing questions about whether it and the volcanic eruption were simultaneous or if one followed the other. This might sound like a minor point since we know that there was seismic activity and a volcanic eruption, but exactly when each of them occurred would have played a part in how the residents of Pompeii tried to escape what was happening.
This research looked specifically at two skeletons, both of them believed to have been men about 50 years in age. They were both inside of a collapsed building, and because they were on top of the volcanic debris rather than underneath it, researchers concluded that they had survived the initial eruption. But then they died when seismic activity caused a wall to collapse on top of them. So that seismic activity starting after the volcano eruption had already started.
Another find at Pompeii was unrelated to the eruption. Work on a ventilation shaft at a 19th century building, which is now home to the Library of the Archaeological Park of Pompeii, unearthed the tomb of a military official named Numerius Agrestinus. He died and was buried decades before the eruption. The find of this tomb during the shaft work came as a surprise.
Next, in February of 2018, we did a two-part episode of the podcast on Sadako Sasaki, who died of leukemia at the age of 12 after being exposed to radiation when the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. Her effort to fold 1,000 origami cranes before her death became symbolic in a movement for peace and nuclear disarmament.
Peace Park in Seattle, Washington was home to a statue of Sadako Sasaki, and we mentioned in the episode that it had been vandalized a couple of times since it was originally placed there. In July of this year, someone cut the statue off at the ankles and stole it from the park. There have been no updates, unfortunately, on this since that happened.
Yeah, it's possible there will be updates between when we record this and when the episode comes out, and if so, we will update people later. We ran prior hosts episode on Tycho Brahe as a Saturday Classic on September 7th of this year, along with so many updates on research that had been done on his exhumated remains. Like, that is the longest introduction to a Saturday Classic in recent memory. New research published in July is not about his remains or the exhumation. It is about his combined residence and laboratory known as Uraniborg. Specifically, it's the analysis of some pieces of pottery and glass that were found at that site.
5 of these fragments have been analyzed to determine what the vessels that they were part of might have contained. This revealed evidence of enriched nickel, copper, zinc, tin, antimony, tungsten, gold, mercury, and lead, with the tungsten find being described as the most surprising. Tungsten had not been isolated or described when Brahe lived, but it does occur naturally in some other minerals.
We did an episode on Stonehenge in December of 2014, and in our July Unearthed last year, we talked about ongoing controversy over a plan to build a tunnel to relocate the highway that runs by the site. That controversy is still ongoing. We mentioned a recommendation that Stonehenge be placed on UNESCO's list of endangered heritage sites, and UNESCO ultimately decided not to do that. The committee has instead asked for an updated report on the conservation of the site by 2025.
Research at the site itself has also suggested that the central altar stone may have been brought there from northeastern Scotland. The team was not allowed to collect new samples from the altar stone, so this research involved analyzing pieces of rock that had been collected in earlier digs, some of them dating back to the 19th century. These samples match sandstone formations of the Orcadian Basin in northeast Scotland. It's not clear how the altar stone would have been moved such a distance and whether that would have happened on land or by water.
This is something of a follow-up to our year-end Unearthed last year, in which we talked about a paper that had concluded that that same altar stone could not have come from Wales, as was previously believed.
We talked about Djoser and Egypt's first pyramid on March 16, 2015. That was very long ago. According to research published in PLOS One on August 5th, this pyramid may have been built with the help of a hydraulic lift system. This step pyramid was built around 2680 BCE, and this paper concludes that the nearby Jisr el-Mudir enclosure may have served as a check dam to collect water and sediment. The purpose of this enclosure was previously unknown, but if that is what it was for, it may have allowed this sediment-filled water to flow into chambers outside the pyramid, where the sediment would settle out of it, with the water carrying on to fill shafts and help to raise blocks to higher levels.
This definitely falls into the category of further research is still needed, because if this whole system really was part of some kind of hydraulic lift, it is not totally clear how the water moved through it or what happened after that in an exact way. It's also possible and really even likely that other methods were also used to move these large stones, things like ramps that would maybe be more straightforwardly expected.
We are going to take a break here, and when we come back, there will be more updates.
Okay, we're back with some more updates. The Alamo and the 1836 Battle of the Alamo have come up on several prior episodes of the show, including on Unearthed. Recently, conservators have worked to preserve a cannon that was used during this battle, as well as the earlier Battle of Medina in 1813 and the Battle of Concepcion in 1835. Unlike the other cannons at the site, this one had started to develop a weird chalky residue on its surface. The exact composition of this residue was unclear, but it seemed to be a byproduct of chemicals that had been used on it during earlier conservation work. The bronze that was used to make this cannon did not have exactly the same formulation as the other cannons at the site. And that is why this one reacted to those chemicals in a way that the other ones did not.
First, they made blocks of bronze with a similar chemical composition to the cannon. Then they applied various preparations to those blocks to test their effects. The team ultimately determined that a formic acid solution could remove the residue without harming the cannon. So they applied it to the surface, charmingly using a tennis ball on a stick.
Yeah, that was one of the most delightful images of all of the unearthed research this time around. Research published in the journal Antiquity has looked at the identities of two people buried in Jamestown. Prior hosts of the show have talked about Jamestown in a couple of different episodes, including one from 2013 on news reports about whether cannibalism had taken place there during the period known as the Starving Time, and one in 2010 about a shipwreck that helped save that settlement.
This research involved DNA from two skeletons, cross-referenced with historical documents. This led to the conclusion that they were Sir Ferdinando Weinman and Captain William West, both of whom were related to the colony's first governor, Thomas West. What the researchers didn't expect was the discovery that these two men were also related through their mothers.
The result from this DNA tests then prompted some additional research through surviving historical documents, trying to figure out what this maternal connection was. One of those documents was a legal case involving an oral will that Captain West had given in court before leaving for the colony. This will had named Mary West Blunt as a beneficiary. According to court proceedings after his death, Mary had raised William on behalf of her late sister, Elizabeth. Mary implied, but did not directly state, that Elizabeth had been William's mother, although she publicly described him as Elizabeth's cousin. Elizabeth had never been married, meaning that Mary was raising a nephew who had been born out of wedlock.
Beyond just the family story here, this research is interesting because it points to some of the ways that more affluent families could keep up appearances and avoid stigma if a baby was born to an unmarried mother. They had enough money to care for Elizabeth's child, and it probably helped that Mary also gave birth to at least 9 children, including around the time that William was born. So an additional child in the mix didn't really raise a lot of eyebrows.
Moving on, prior hosts of the show did an episode on Alan Turing, which came out on September 10th, 2012. 2 of Alan Turing's notebooks have been put up for sale. They relate to a portable encryption project known as Delilah. British authorities have placed an export ban on these notebooks with the hope that a British institution will acquire them so that they will remain in Britain. There just are not a lot of unpublished research notes by Alan Turing remaining today, largely because he didn't actually keep a lot of working documents or correspondence. The recommended price for this is £379,680, which is about $516,000. And Britain's export bar on these documents expires on November 15th. So they are hoping some kind of museum or institute or whatever will step up and commit to buying it before then.
We talked about Easter Island on a recent Unearthed and research into rock gardening techniques on the island that suggested it had not been through some kind of ecocide. Research published in the journal Nature in September continues to build on a growing body of research that supports that same conclusion. The study published in September involves research into ancient Rapa Nui genomes and involved ongoing meetings and feedback from the Rapa Nui community.
This genetic research was looking for evidence that the population of what is known as Easter Island had gone through some kind of catastrophic collapse, and it did not find evidence of that having happened. But it did find some suggestion of contact between the people of Rapa Nui and the indigenous peoples of South America, with that contact probably happening sometime between the years 1250 and 1430. There's a whole progression of episodes and unearthed installments on Easter Island in our archive. We sort of walked through them all the last time we discussed research about the island last time.
We have done episodes on the Voynich manuscript and on Wilfrid Voynich, and we've talked about a number of attempts to decode that manuscript and included those on Unearthed. This time, we're not talking about a decoding attempt. Lisa Fagan Davis, the executive director of the Medieval Academy of America, has published a set of 10 multispectral scans of pages of the manuscript. These include UV and infrared scans, which can reveal previously undetected details about the pages themselves.
Even if you don't know anything about how to interpret any of this, these look really cool.
Yes, they do.
Davis wrote about the images in her blog in September. Scans of the 10 pages are available in a Google Drive folder. The scans were actually taken 10 years ago, and the plan at that time had been to make them available right away, or at least pretty quickly, but for various reasons that didn't happen until now.
Davis's blog is at manuscriptroadtrip.wordpress.com, and the blog post includes some cautions about jumping to conclusions based on these images, plus some advice on how to understand this kind of imaging.
There's really so much stuff about all of this in Davis's blog post, including a look at some Roman alphabet characters that were added to the manuscript later on. Davis concludes that they were made by Johannes Marcus Marci, who owned the manuscript in the mid-17th century. Davis also looks at questions like whether there is evidence that this parchment was reused, which there really isn't. If you're interested in the Voynich manuscript at all, this whole blog post is well worth a visit and a thorough read on your own. Again, it is at manuscriptroadtrip, that is all one word, .wordpress.com.
The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum is undergoing a major restoration project, which is moving into its final phase. And this includes work in the Dutch Room, which was home to 6 of the 13 works that were stolen in a heist in 1990. We put out an update to Past Hosts episode on that heist on April 30th, 2014.
This restoration work is being done without closing the gallery off to museum visitors, so people will be able to see the work as it happens. The work that's being done involves conservation of the artwork, as well as restoration and renovation of the building itself. The lighting is also going to be updated to make it more energy efficient.
Next, new photos of the Titanic show ongoing decay at the wreck site, including the collapse of part of the deck railing. The 15-foot section of railing basically fell straight down to the seafloor. A bronze statue of the goddess Diana has been found on the seafloor as well. This statue used to be on top of the fireplace mantel in the first-class lounge. Unlike the railing, which seems to have fallen due to the wreck's inevitable decay, this statue was likely dislodged as the ship broke apart when it sank.
Kind of tangentially related, the U.S. Coast Guard held hearings into the disaster aboard the Titan submersible that imploded during a voyage to the Titanic in 2023. In our episode on the wreck of the Andrea Doria, we talked about one of the efforts to map that wreck that had been done by OceanGate in 2016 using one of its earlier submersibles, which was known as Cyclops 1. There were some contradictions in witness testimonies about the details of this dive and sort of what the tenor of the conversation was to the people who were on board. But multiple witnesses stated that OceanGate founder Stockton Rush got the Cyclops 1 stuck under part of the Andrea Doria during one of those dives. The Titanic has come up in a number of past episodes, and we talked about the Andrea Doria in May of this year.
Moving on, Sir John Franklin's expedition aboard the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror has been the subject of a number of episodes and updates on Unearthed. Here's the latest. Researchers have identified a jawbone that was found on King William Island as belonging to James Fitzjames, a captain on the HMS Erebus. This conclusion came from comparison between DNA extracted from the jawbone to 25 living descendants of the expedition's crew. They also noted that this jawbone showed evidence of cut marks that could be indicative of cannibalism.
In our last update, on May 28th, 2022, we released an episode on Thomas Hardy and his relationships with his first wife, Emma Giffords, and his second wife, Florence Dugdale. Hardy had a home built in Dorset known as Max Gate, and that's where he lived with Emma and where he met Florence and then where he lived with Florence after he married her after Emma's death.
Some burial sites were discovered while the house was being built, which led Hardy to believe that the land had once been an ancient burial ground. In 1891, he found a large sarsen stone, which he called the Druid Stone, and had re-erected in his garden. But decades after his death, it was discovered that a large, circular Neolithic enclosure, described as a proto-Stonehenge, was buried underneath it. This enclosure dated back to about 3000 BCE. A more recent dig in 2022 found that there was activity at the site at least 500 years before that, meaning that this is one of the oldest sites in southwestern England.
Part of this enclosure was destroyed during road work, which uncovered another sarsen stone that was also erected in the garden. But now this site has been protected. Remains of Neolithic enclosure and associated features at Max Gate was added to England's National Heritage List in August of this year. Considering the role that Stonehenge played in Hardy's novel Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is probably the novel he's best known for, it's one I had to read in high school. I think he might have thought that was cool.
I bet he would. I was a Jude the Obscure girl. That is it for our many updates this round. So we are going to pause here for a sponsor break.
We have a few finds this time that can fall under the umbrella of weaponry or possibly tools, which could be a weapon in some circumstances. We will start with some axes, which can be both a weapon and a tool. At the end of June, someone mailed 2 axe heads to the National Museum of Ireland. They mailed them in a porridge box, cushioned in foam that had been cut to fit. I am delighted by that packaging method. A letter accompanying the axe heads was not signed, but said that someone had found them using a metal detector and wanted them to be conserved. Museum staff analyzed the axe heads and they determined that they dated back to the early Bronze Age, which is about 2150 to 2000 BCE. But the staff needed to know more about exactly where these axe heads were found to be able to really study them. So the museum put out a public appeal for the person who had sent them to come forward in July.
A farmer named Thomas Dunn came forward not long after. It's illegal in Ireland to use a metal detector to look for artifacts, but that's not what Dunn was doing. A piece of metal had fallen off of a mower while he was cutting silage, and he was afraid it would damage the silage harvester if he didn't find it. So he was looking for this piece of mower when he just accidentally happened to stumble onto the axe heads.
Since coming forward, Dunn has taken researchers from the museum to the spot where he found this axe head. In quotes to reporters, he described the folks from the National Museum of Ireland as, quote, horrid happy over this whole discovery. This is a colloquialism I had not heard before, and I find horrid happy to be so delightful.
Mm-hmm. And perfect for the Halloween season. I'm horrid happy. In other axe news, a marine archaeologist off the coast of Arendal in southern Norway, no Anna or Elsa there, has found an axe head, this one dating to the Middle Bronze Age around 1100 BCE. This is the first known prehistoric metal artifact to be found in Norwegian waters, and he made this find during a routine survey in a pile of much more recent ship ballast. It's not clear whether this axe was part of the ballast or whether it came from a different shipwreck.
Our next weapon-related find is that archaeologists working at Minuteman National Historical Park in Concord, Massachusetts, have found 5 musket balls from the Battle of Concord, which took place on April 19, 1775. The musket balls were unearthed last year. Preliminary work suggested they had been fired by the colonial militia at British troops. The musket balls range in size from 40 caliber to 70 caliber, and that's part of the reasoning for identifying them as coming from militia weapons, because unlike the British forces who had standardized ammunition, the militia brought their own weapons and ammo, so it's tended to be an assortment of whatever people had to work with. Also, These musket balls were intact, so it does not appear that they actually hit anything they were being fired at.
Moving on, in prior episodes of Unearthed, we've talked about research involving projectile points, thrown javelins, and atlatls, and how prehistoric peoples might have used these things to hunt. Research published in the journal PLOS One comes to a different conclusion, that Clovis points may have been used on planted pikes, braced against the ground in the face of charging megafauna. Clovis points are sometimes described as projectile points, but since the weapons they were attached to have not survived until today, we don't know for sure exactly how they were used.
The team reviewed historical documents on the use of pikes and other braced weapons. And then to test this hypothesis, the team designed a series of experiments to see things like how much force it took for the point of one of these, like a replica that they made to pierce a piece of untanned cowhide, how much force it took for the lashings holding a point to a shaft to rupture, and what actually happened when a point encountered an oak plank, which was meant to simulate bone.
They found that it was possible for a Clovis point lashed to a braced shaft to seriously injure something like a large mammal. The proposed next step is to construct a dynamic experiment with a moving mass, something like a block of ballistics gel.
And our last weapon, a sword has disappeared from the village of Rocamadour in southwestern France. This is a sword that, according to lore, was Durandal, which belonged to Charlemagne's knight Roland and was made famous in the epic poem The Song of Roland. To be clear, this sword that has disappeared did not date all the way back to 1300 years ago when Charlemagne was living. It was a replica that was installed in the rock as a tourist attraction, but that might have happened as early ago as the 1780s. So while the town acknowledges that this was not really Roland's sword, still sees the sword as part of the local heritage.
Moving on now to a few medical finds. Researchers have used CT scanning to get a closer look at 2,000-year-old Roman surgical tools to try to develop a more thorough understanding of how they might have been used. These instruments include a bronze scalpel handle, 2 surgical probes, a spoon, and 2 needles.
This CT scanner created 3D models of each of the tools, as well as using X-ray technologies to give a sense of what the tools looked like underneath the existing corrosion that's on their surface. 3D printed versions of these models will also allow some further research and the creation of physical replicas to be used in classrooms. This research has already revealed some things about the tools themselves. For example, the way this scalpel handle was crafted allowed for easy removal and replacement of scalpel blades.
Researchers from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden and the Globe Institute have analyzed the bones of 108 people who died about 5,000 years ago. And they found evidence to suggest that 18 of them, or 17%, were infected with plague when they died. Over a period of about 120 years, cases of plague struck 3 different generations of the same family. This suggests that plague was common in Scandinavia during this period. None of the strains involved were the one that caused the Black Death at the start of the second plague pandemic thousands of years later, but research suggested this strain was capable of causing an epidemic.
This means it's possible that plague may have played a role in the population loss that happened around this time, which is known as the Neolithic decline. But researchers involved with this project specified that this is really circumstantial. It doesn't conclusively prove that plague was involved in the Neolithic decline, but it does rule out theories that argued that plague was not a factor or even that plague did not exist in this area at this point.
Speaking of illnesses, researchers from Sweden and Spain have been studying an isolated early medieval community in northern Spain. This was an interdisciplinary project that looked at this community and the people who lived there from a lot of different angles, including evidence of illnesses and conditions that the people experienced. One turned out to be variola virus. That is the virus that causes smallpox. specifically a strain that was similar to ones found in Scandinavia, Germany, and Russia. This offers a possible explanation for how and when smallpox was first introduced into what's now Spain, but also how widespread different strains of smallpox were during the Middle Ages.
Lastly, researchers at the University of Milan have found traces of components from Erythroxylum coca in mummified brain matter. The tissue dates back to the early 1600s in Italy, and cocaine is derived from this plant. Erythroxylum coca is native to South America, and it was previously thought to have been introduced to Europe in the 18th century. So later than this, attempts to send samples across the Atlantic Ocean earlier than that failed because the samples just did not survive the journey.
This tissue came from a burial site near a major hospital, but it's not totally clear whether people might have been using this plant for medicine or for recreation. People probably would have used it by chewing on the leaves, and it isn't documented in hospital records.
Now, we've got some books and letters, and I took a kind of expansive view of what counts as a book here.
Great.
First, 12,000-year-old markings on a stone pillar in Turkey may be the world's oldest solar calendar. This conclusion comes from counting little V-shaped symbols that were carved into the pillars, finding that they might represent 365 days. There are also additional symbols that would line up with the summer solstice and markings for the phases of the sun and the moon. The carvings at this temple also seem to mark the date that a swarm of comet fragments collided with the Earth roughly 13,000 years ago, or around 10,850 BCE.
In similar news, newly translated cuneiform tablets seem to have been used by ancient Babylonians to make predictions based off of lunar eclipses. These tablets are 4,000 years old and seem to have been a tool for celestial divination, connecting astronomical events to things like the deaths of kings or disease epidemics.
And in another cuneiform find, restoration work following a series of earthquakes that struck Turkey and Syria in 2023 has unearthed a tiny cuneiform tablet. Several excavation sites were damaged or reburied in Turkey during these earthquakes, and new excavations at one of the damaged sites turns up what appeared to be a receipt measuring less than 2 inches square, dating back to the 15th century BCE, describing the purchase of a large amount of furniture. So it's a little tiny cuneiform tablet of someone's little shopping trip for some furniture.
I love it. A strip of wood found in Japan is roughly 1,300 years old and appears to be part of a multiplication table. If it were intact, it would be a tablet measuring about 33 centimeters long. But this is only a fragment of it. It's a little strip that measures 16.2 centimeters by 1.2 centimeter. It's believed that this was used by workers in a guard's office in what was then Japan's capital of Fujiwara-kyo.
A transcript of a musical work, probably by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, from when he was a teenager, has been found in a German library. This is a 12-minute piece that was written for a string trio, and it may have been written for his sister. There is some suggestion that his sister may have been the person who preserved this piece of music. This piece is just known as Serenade in C, and it was performed publicly for the first time in centuries in September. A second performance followed that by the Leipzig Opera, and that one is available at YouTube.
That could have also gone in updates.
It could have.
Since we have talked about his sister before. And lastly, archaeology students in northern France have found a message in a bottle. One that was left by archaeologist P.J. Ferret at the site when he worked there in 1825. It's a very simple note, tied with a string and placed in a glass vial, noting his name and that he was a member of various intellectual societies and when he was there, before noting that he was continuing his work at the city of Limes or Caesar's Camp.
And that's the first chunk of our Unearthed stuff. We'll talk about more on Wednesday. I also have some listener mail.
Fantastic.
This is from Julia. I answered Julia, but I thought other people might have curiosity about the same thing. So I'm going to read the whole thing. Julia says, "Hi, Holly and Tracy. First and foremost, thank you both for traveling with me to work. As someone who doesn't fare well when left alone with my thoughts, you two make my commute infinitely less stressful. Secondly, I'm curious about how you both decide which form of a name to use. I have noticed a fascinating trend where you sometimes opt for the native name of a place, which I find really intriguing. For example, in one podcast, I heard you refer to Turkey as Turkia, but still used Germany and Poland instead of Deutschland or Polska. I'm curious what guides your choice to use the native name in some cases, but not others. I tend to code switch quite a bit myself. Sometimes it's about the audience, sometimes it's just out of habit. But I was really interested in how you make these decisions. P.S. Here's my pet tax. Meet Ramses, my hairless sphinx. He's usually found snuggled under blankets, and in the picture, he's giving me side eye because I sat down a bit too aggressively next to him. The video was quite the surprise. He actually hates putting his head in tight places, and the water is flavored sparkling water. I fully expected him to turn his nose up at it, but to my astonishment, he actually liked it. Thank you again for all you do. We have, yes, a very adorable cat making a very grumpy face.
Justice for Ramses. Don't sit down too quickly next to a kitty. I'm kidding.
So yeah, that's an incredibly cute thing. So I answered Julia, but so Turkey actually requested that the United Nations recognize the nation as Turkey and not as Turkey for various reasons, including in the fact that in English, turkey is an animal that a lot of people don't necessarily have a high opinion of and can also be used to insult people by calling them a turkey. So this was one of many reasons that like Turkey was like, hey, United Nations, we would really like for our name to be Turkey and not Turkey. And so if you look at things like the United Nations list of member states, that's how it's spelled now. And so that's like what has driven the way that we say Turkey specifically. Similarly, places in Ukraine have specifically tried to get people to use pronunciations and sort of anglicized versions that are based off of Ukrainian pronunciations rather than Russian pronunciations. And so that has driven those pronunciations as well. Places like Germany and Poland have not really had that kind of a PR effort. And also, like, we have English language names for these places, and our podcast is in English to a mostly English-speaking audience. So to me, it would be weird if we started trying to use, like, German names for, like, if we started trying to call Germany Deutschland rather than Germany. Sometimes when we're talking about especially cities and towns that don't exist anymore or places that are really remote and there's not like an English language pronunciation for something like there is for, say, Paris or Barcelona or whatever, we're just going to do our best. Like, we're probably going to sound more French when we're talking about a tiny town in a remote area of France rather than Paris. So yeah, sometimes it's just a judgment call, but sometimes in places like Turkey and Kyiv in the Ukraine and things like that, like there has been a formal effort on the part of that place and the people living there for people to use a particular pronunciation. Sometimes we might not have heard about such efforts and folks let us know, and then we go, oh, we should probably say it this way now. So yeah.
Language, ever evolving.
Ever evolving.
I mean, my rule of thumb is this will make you laugh and laugh because I've done this before.
Okay.
If Duolingo uses it in the conversation of the place that is not translated and then gives you an alternate translation, that to me is a good guide also.
Sure.
Right. Like if you are learning a language in Duolingo and they call it French, but then when they're teaching you the language, they call it Français. And I'm like, well, there you go. Or, you know.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about in my Duolingo when you're learning the French terms for other nations and cities and stuff. Like,
Angleterre,
Yeah.
Allemande.
That kind of stuff. Yeah. Yeah. And like there's also just not an official rule. So we're kind of doing the thing that seems to make the most sense.
Yeah, I feel like going by the UN list is a good policy.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much for that email, Julia, and the super cute picture. If you would like to write to us about this or any other podcast, we're at historypodcast@iheartradio.com, and you can subscribe to our show on the iHeartRadio app or wherever else you like to get your podcasts. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.